Interesting study that came out. We wanted to try to get to the bottom of this. As I said, we talked about Airbnb a while ago, of course, partly at the time after that tragic fire in Old Montreal, and people saying, well, wait a sec, there are places being used as Airbnb rentals when they shouldn't be. We're licensed with the government. There was a big reaction at the time, and really not much talk about it since. But then this report comes out and shows that short-term rental platforms like Airbnb now appear to be losing popularity with travelers, with hotels bouncing back. Okay, why is this happening? Let's find out. Makarand Mody is an associate professor of hospitality marketing at Boston University, is on the line. Thanks for being with us this afternoon.
Thanks for having me.
Let me begin by asking a simple question here. Is this simply because it's getting more expensive to rent a place from Airbnb as compared to what hotels would cost you?
Yeah, I'd say that's definitely a primary factor. As with most things in the travel and hospitality business, price is a key factor for how consumers actually behave. And we've seen the price differential between hotels and Airbnb shrink over the years. Particularly sort of in a post-COVID world, and with travel prices rising more generally. So I would say that is a primary driver. But there are other concerns as well. I think. I think for a while, Airbnb had become really a part of the public consciousness and had done such a brilliant job of marketing itself that more travelers were leaning towards it. I think over time, some of that sheen has been lost, and people have realized that the service and the human elements that you get from hotels are not something you can replicate in an Airbnb where there's typically no host to welcome you.
Yeah, I wonder with respect to hotels starting to make up some of the difference here. Obviously, they weren't doing this in a vacuum. They were realizing that business was being lost to Airbnb. What did hotels do you think, to attract some of that business?
Yeah, I think for the longest period of time there was a bit of denial as far as hotels were concerned. They didn't quite see Airbnb as a threat, and then obviously when it started to hurt the bottom line, they realized that they needed to do something different. I think there's been a few things in here. They've borrowed some of the experience elements from Airbnb, which I think has worked. So, for example, some of the newer hotel brands that are being designed have elements of that community built in. They have some of the amenities that someone might find at an Airbnb built in there, like washing facilities or kitchenettes where people can kind of do a little bit of their own food preparation. So they've borrowed some of that element. But I also think in general, hotels and brands are doing a better job of realizing that what they're in the business of selling is not just a room for people to sleep, but it's the entire experience. So even thinking about the public spaces in hotels, for example, or the opportunities that hotels now afford outside of the property, I think they've just become so much better at creating and marketing just more exciting experiences than they did through the new brands that they're creating.
So you mentioned there are other factors, of course, at play here with respect to why this is beginning to happen outside of hotels sort of catching up, if you will. What are some of those? And I wonder, would some of that be the fact that we know cities? I mentioned Montreal's particular case. We had a deadly fire in part of the city. The rooms were rented out as Airbnb, only they weren't on the site. They weren't official. They should have been licensed in Word. And we know that other cities have gone to great strides to get rid or to not allow Airbnb in certain parts of the city.
Absolutely. Regulation has caught up. It took a long time, and every jurisdiction was sort of doing its own thing as far as regulation is concerned. There's no standardized regulation anywhere. Particularly in cities that have taken a stricter stance on Airbnb, which are cities where housing has already been a problem, we have seen the supply of Airbnb drop quite significantly. So in the United States, for example, New York City has some of the strictest regulations on the books. And now if you actually look for Airbnbs in Manhattan, it is a fraction of what used to show up a couple of years ago. And even in cities like Boston, where I'm at, they've made the licensing process as well as the regulations around that licensing a little bit harder.
Yeah.
So Boston's a little more liberal. New York's a much more strict when it comes to enforcement. And the reduced supply means that now the only place or the more likely place that you'll have to stay is a hotel.
I would wonder as well. Clearly, this is all happening. I said hotels don't live in a vacuum, but neither does Airbnb. They've noticed the change to their business. Are they, from what you've noticed or are noticing, are they changing the way they operate to try to make up for this?
Yeah, I think they are. They kind of realize as well, particularly during COVID, a lot of hosts abandoned the platform and they had to go to the long-term market because they realized that travel was going to be a little slow for the next year. But then we saw this preponderance of longer-term stays that lasted, between 2021 and 2023 when people were working from home and from anywhere. Airbnb realized that its primary model was not short-term, but really longer-term stays. That seems to have dwindled a little bit now that we're into 2024. And Airbnb has realized that now the short-term model is coming back. So the way they market to hosts is changing, and I think that's a big part of their strategy. And for consumers, I think one of the things they've really had to do is introduce more transparency into the process. So, this price differential that I talked about, it was really hard to figure out what price you're paying at Airbnb till you actually got to checkout.
Right.
And now if you go on, they've changed their pricing model where they show you everything except taxes right up front, so you can make a more informed decision as a consumer. So, around transparency, around hosts, they've had to change things in how they operate.
Yeah, it's funny. As I hear you say that, I'm thinking about airlines who've done the same thing, right? You think you're paying one thing for a ticket. By the time you get done, you're paying considerably more. So that was the Airbnb model. That's the one that's now changing.
Absolutely, yeah, and that's changing. And at least in the United States, they've been mulling regulations that would impact the hotel business. I don't think anything's been sort of put into effect yet. But yeah, with airlines and debundling, it seems to have become more of a commonplace model. But I don't think consumers appreciate it. And at least in Airbnb's case, we're seeing somewhat of a reversal.
Yeah, I will point out one other thing, and maybe you can comment on that as well. The one thing, sadly, for Airbnb that we do hear from time to time is these horror stories of people ending up in a place and it turned out to be an absolutely miserable experience. And it's not isolated. They seem to happen on a fairly regular basis. So that's, I imagine, one of the reasons as well.
It does. And, it sort of creeps into the public consciousness. I don't know, on a day-to-day basis, consumers aren't necessarily monitoring for safety-related stories, but when they do make the headlines, these are obviously horror stories. And there's three kinds of consumers that we've noticed in the research that we've done. There are the Airbnb consumers who will largely stay with Airbnbs. There's hotel consumers who I know as well who will never stay at an Airbnb. And there's all those people in the middle. Now, if you're in the middle and you see these stories coming out more and more often, you're going to reconsider your decision to stay at an Airbnb, and you automatically start leaning towards that hotel category. And I think that's happened more. The safety incidents have only proliferated, and that does push a lot of consumers, I think, into that hotel bucket. There's still folks who will always be, reliant on Airbnb and go that way, but I think a lot of those people in the middle are rethinking their decisions.
So, just as a final question, I'm not sure this is fair to ask, but even now, with Airbnb losing some of this business, and obviously, it's becoming a mature business, is it a sustainable model, do you believe?
Yeah, it's a great question. Till the COVID pandemic hit, it was really 10 to 11 years of pure economic growth that Airbnb was able to, grow into. COVID really was sort of an inflection point for everyone, but particularly a young company like Airbnb. They seem to have recovered really well for till about 2023. I think a lot of that was just the revenge travel from COVID that was really boosting all of accommodation. I think the next 5 years are going to be really critical to answer your question, Aaron, whether this is truly a sustainable business model. Interestingly, outside of the homes, they've tried things like Airbnb experiences, which hasn't worked for them. They've mulled this idea of a flight booking platform, but it's never really come to fruition. So Airbnb truly is at this inflection point where they're trying to figure out what is our next move after homes. Because like you said, after a point, there's only so many homes that are going to be put on the platform because you're going to saturate the market.
Interesting story, interesting analysis. Mr. Mody, I thank you so much. Very much appreciate your time today.
I appreciate you having me on, Aaron.
Makarand Mody at Boston University on... there you go. The sustainability, viability of Airbnb down the road. Interesting.